most of us probably have some kind of wounds or some kind of like, biases is in the way that like the way that your family operated, the way that you kind of see your mother and father, the way that like you're going to tend to look at like a romantic partner, and the way that you're going to tend to look at, one day when you have children, how that operates. The important thing to remember is that like we need to cut our parents a heck of a lot of slack when we start talking about this, because like you may well have wounds from your childhood. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were mistakes made by your parents, so much as just like ways that you perceived things, ways that you understood things, ways that you like took those relationships on your side of it, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that your parents made mistakes that you have wounds. But the reality is that your parents did almost certainly make mistakes somewhere along the line. And one day, you're going to be sitting in a hospital room looking at your newborn child, and you're going to be terrified by the reality that you're going to make a bunch of mistakes as a parent too. The same way that like we carry expectations into a relationship of like what male and female is, we carry expectations also of what like motherhood and fatherhood is, right? So like we've got actually just a bunch of examples kind of listed out here as ways to help kind of illustrate this point. For example, if you had a dad that worked early in the morning until late at night, right? Like you have this understanding of fatherhood as like, my dad works all day long. Like that's what my dad does, So when you then move on to get married, you're going to walk into marriage with this understanding of, if I'm the man, I need to work all day long because that's what a dad does. Or if you're a wife, like my husband should be gone all day long because that's what a dad does, right? And like in that same sense, you might have like a good or negative view of that. A good dad is someone who works all day long. If my job is only 8 hours a day, that means I'm a bad dad. So I need to get a job that's longer. Or like my dad was never around when I was a kid. So a dad that works all day is a bad father. Like I'm not saying that about my dad. I'm just saying like, for example, right? Like if my dad is gone all day long and I hated that, I don't want to be the kind of dad who works all day long. Or like the wife, like, oh, you're working late again? Like triggers that wound of like bad dads are working all day long. Do you know what I mean? Like just like that little example, it's like the way that our parents parented like influences the way that we see not only our own identity as mothers and fathers, but also like our expectations of our spouse, right? You've got maybe a mom who's the one who's kind of entirely in charge of the house, of organizing everything in the household, of like keeping things straight, of doing everything like that. Like that's what I'm used to when I grow up, right? So then I get married and my new wife doesn't do that. And in my mind, it's like, okay, then she's a bad mother and a bad wife because that's what my mom did, Or like for a girl whose mother did that, like, oh, there's now this expectation. This is what I have to do because that's what a mother does, You can imagine and those are just like really simple things. Imagine like somebody who grows up with a single mother or a single father, right? Like imagine how that's going to change their understanding of what a family should be. If they're used to seeing their one parent do everything within a relationship, like how are they going to adapt to there being a team in a relationship? Like how are they going to respond to that difference, right? If somebody walks into a relationship and they had divorced parents, like how is that going to influence the way that they see a relationship? If their parents always fought, if they bounce back and forth between houses like the weekend and the week, that sort of thing. Like when it's their turn to get married, they're walking into that marriage with an understanding of like, it's not permanent, or marriage is nasty, or my parents are distant to each other. And so that's what I'm going to be with my spouse, right? You walk into that with a different understanding of conflict. Maybe you're really in love with your spouse, and the first time you have a fight, the thought enters your mind of, are we getting a divorce? Does this mean it's over? Because that's what you saw your parents do. If you have suspicions about your spouse, like the thought comes in your head that maybe they're being unfaithful because your parents cheated on each other. Like, how's that going to amp up your paranoia and the way that you're suspicious, right? So again, part of the reason we're talking about these things is not if you had a single parent, you're ruined. No, the point is you're walking into, even now, a relationship with understandings of what a family and a relationship should be. You're walking into this already with a sort of vision and influence on what marriage is based on what you saw your parents do, for better or for worse, right? And again, there's not going to be any family that's just the perfect family, right? So it's good to be cognizant and aware, and even now to kind of ask questions of yourself of how does the way that I've seen my parents growing up, the way that I've seen their marriage, the way that our family worked out, how does that influence my understanding of what family and marriage should be?
I knew fairly early on that I'm going to screw up my kids in some way. I'm a fallible human being. I don't want to, but that's going to happen because I'm fallen. And so with that, I always pray that the wounds that I incur, that I give in my children, are either lessened or that they are lessened to the degree to which either I can help heal them or fix them later in their life, that I can create a bond good enough with my children in which they can approach me later and be like, hey, Dad, I was really hurt when you did this when I was growing up. Or I believe about this about myself because of the way that you acted. And so in a large way, I pray for that, or I pray that God will provide the people in their lives so that they can heal from those wounds that I'm going to give. So yeah, really be aware of those wounds that you bring in, and particularly from your family. And that's one of the things that you can actually start working on now, because asking yourself, doing that good work of trying to figure it out. You might have hated the way that your parents disciplined you or didn't discipline you. And so when you see your future spouse disciplining either in the opposite way or a similar way, it might trigger that response and be like, whoa, you're I'm not okay with that. Or you might resent your father for never being present when you were young. And so if you take a job, even if you're really good about communicating, but let's say you take a job that forces you to travel all the time, be okay, well, you're not going to be home as much then. That can affect things. So 2 examples from my own life is when my dad grew up, he actually grew up in a way in which his dad never taught him how to be handy around the house. And so there was never, he grew up and felt man, I'm not a man because I don't know how to swing a hammer. I don't know how to be a man because of the fact that I don't know how to mow the lawn or do whatever it may be. All the typical tasks that you associate with oh, dad's the handyman around the house. And so he made it a habit of 1, teaching himself, but then 2 is anytime that me or my brother growing up, anytime that he was doing a project, we always got roped in, even if we didn't want to be involved. It was no, you're going to help me install a new bathroom. You're going to help me mow the lawn. You're going to help me do this, just so that we would have those things that he didn't have growing up. The other example too is that, so I grew up not really being close with any of my extended family. I actually can't even tell you who all my cousins are on my dad's side. But with that, one of the things that created a wound in me for was I was taught that then family is fickle, because in one sense it's well, my parents don't even interact with their parents, so basically when I grow up I'm supposed to leave the home. But then I made a conscious effort when I became a parent that I'm going to make sure that my kids know their grandparents. I want them to know their aunts and uncles. I want them to know their cousins. And so it's really important to know what's going on, where are these wounds, where do they come from, and if you can, talk about them with your parents. And the beautiful thing about it is in our faith we believe that all wounds can be healed. Christ is the divine healer, and so he can redeem all things. Pray about it, think about it. How can I handle these wounds? How can I grow with grow through them, because even Christ himself still bore the wounds after his resurrection. And so it's not bad necessarily that we have our wounds. Our wounds can be signs of love as well.
Most of us, when we think about marriage, you might not be able to think of like many examples of like really awesome, fruitful marriages where you just look at them and they're like, oh, they're so happy together, so much in love, you know? Like a lot of relationships these days, a lot of marriages, you know, a lot of people come from households where divorce was an issue. A lot of people come from households where, you know, mom and dad maybe didn't get along just super well. A lot of people come from households where there was at least some like family tension or family flaw, right? So not everybody has really awesome examples of like, oh, that's what a healthy marriage is. You know what I mean? So it's good to kind of look into like, if it's true that not many people have like this like exemplar of a happy marriage, like when we look at marriages, what is our understanding of what a good marriage is, and like maybe what biases or misunderstandings or wounds exist even in that perception of a happy marriage, right? So, for instance, like if either of your parents or within your parents or your family, there was like a really bad, like there's really bad alcoholism, for example, like that can ruin people's understandings of like fatherhood or motherhood. You know, like can really mess with it. I shouldn't say ruin. If somebody grew up in a household where there was physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, like that's going to really, really harm the way that you see what a healthy relationship is. If you go into if you grew up in a family where there was like really bad, like sort of like psychological codependency with like different things, like that sort of thing, like that's going to really, really influence the way that you see relationships. If you walk into a relationship and your understanding of like home and family was a very sort of like transitory thing, like either like you just moved a lot as a kid and you've got this idea that marriage is just, that the family is just like always shifting. Maybe like somebody could have grown up like moving from one parent's house to another parent's house, to like another relative's house, to like their grandma's house, to their aunt's house. Like, think of how badly that would influence the way that you see relationships and family as like a stable, permanent thing. If you grew up in a relationship where you like regularly saw like a lack of commitment to like lifelong and faithful aspects of marriage, right? So like if divorce was a regular part of your parents' experience, if your parents have like multiple sexual partners, if people were living together in like a trial marriage or just like living in situation, one of your parents just had like serial boyfriends or girlfriends while you were in the household, like you better believe that's going to influence the way that you see marriage when it's your turn. You know, you're going to walk into marriage with like kind of different ideas of permanence and different ideas of self-gift and different ideas of commitment and different ideas of stability and different ideas of love, because maybe you didn't have like a great witness of that in one way or the other as a child, right? Another thing that like sometimes you can see is marriages where like people see their parents fighting as though it's like a competition in a sense. You know, sometimes parents, this is kind of rough. Like parents can do this thing to their kids sometimes where it's like they're competing for their children's favor. Especially if you have like a divorced relationship, it might be like, oh, you like me more because I give you all these gifts, you know, and you hate going to your mother's house, don't you? And then when they go to the other house, oh, you hate your father, don't you? He's always so mean to you and da-da-da-da-da. But I let you do these things, right? Or parents will say to their kids like, oh yeah, your mother, you know, she's telling you have to go to bed at this time, but I'm letting you stay up till this time or something like that. It's like, that is so dangerous and so harmful to a relationship. And like, if you grew up in a household where that was happening, that's going to like really really mess with your understanding of like the relationship that should exist between a mother and a father, like within a family. And none of these things are like if this is your experience, you're doomed. Or if this is your boyfriend or girlfriend's experience, like run away. Like it's not like red flag, deal breaker, like run away as far as you can. It's just like all of us grew up in human families. Like human beings make mistakes and human beings aren't perfect. And our relationships are often not all that even we would want them to be. And when we look at like our understanding of what relationships should be, they're going to be pretty heavily influenced by what we saw in our own families, what we saw in our own parents, what we saw in the way that they loved and treated each other. So all of this is just like, if you see any, especially in your own heart, any wounds in that respect, if you see any like kind of like biases or bad influences, or even just like perspectives that resulted from the way that you were raised, the way that you saw your family, like there's such an opportunity there for like healing and like actually an opportunity for an even greater love, like an opportunity for an even greater triumph, like lessons learned. You know what I mean? Like how many times even in our lives can we look back and say like times where we said, oh, I never want to be like that, or I don't want to experience that again. And it like drove us to be freaking awesome, or drove us to love in a new way, or drove us to be better, right? Like sometimes those biases, sometimes those negative experiences, sometimes those wounds result in an even greater love and even greater triumph.